The Stellar Combat Institute hung in space like a monument to organized violence and poly-disguised xenophobia. Its crystalline spires twisted upward in mathematically perfect spirals, each one housing training facilities designed to accommodate the galaxy's most promising young warriors, a designation that, coincidentally, seemed to correlate directly with one species' natural capacity for creative destruction. The Institute's founding charter spoke eloquently of fostering interspecies martial excellence through collaborative education, which was bureaucratic speak for teaching the galaxy's apex predators new and improved ways to eliminate anything that might threaten their position at the top of the food chain. The Academy operated on what its administrators called the Combat Worthiness Index, a delightfully scientific-sounding system that ranked species based on their evolutionary advantages in mortal combat. The molten core species, with their crystalline exoskeletons and ability to manipulate superheated plasma, naturally occupied the top tier. Phase walkers, who could slip between dimensional barriers like cosmic ghosts, held prestigious positions in the second rank. The void renders, whose presence could unravel molecular bonds, claimed spots in the upper echelons with the casual arrogance of those born to destroy. And then, somewhere near the bottom of this carefully calibrated hierarchy of lethality, sat the humans. The current academic cycle had introduced what the Institute's marketing department cheerfully termed an inclusion initiative, though everyone understood it was really an elaborate social experiment to see how badly the galaxy's Olcerans would fare when placed in direct competition with their genetic superiors. The initiative had admitted representatives from 37 marginal species, each one selected for their demonstrated ability to survive in environments that didn't actively try to kill them, a qualification that the Institute's board apparently found both amusing and pedagogically valuable. The Academy's physical structure reflected its philosophical commitments with depressing clarity. The apex predator species occupied the upper levels, where vast training chambers could accommodate their destructive capabilities without risk to the infrastructure. The middle-tier species inhabited floors designed with appropriate safety margins for their particular brands of mayhem. The bottom dwellers, humans, the aquatic Calpoi, the insectoid buzzhai, and other such evolutionary disappointments, found themselves relegated to basement levels where the worst they could do was scuff the floors. Master Instructor Kethmorg stood at the center of Combat Arena Prime, his crystalline exoskeleton catching and refracting the overhead lighting into prismatic rainbows that would have been beautiful if they weren't emanating from something that could level city blocks without breaking a sweat. His species, the Apex Ravagers, had earned their place at the top of the galactic hierarchy through the simple expedient of being virtually indestructible while simultaneously capable of channeling raw energy through their bodies like living weapons. Kethmorg himself had reportedly reduced an entire asteroid field to component particles during his graduation demonstration, though whether this was academic achievement or showing off remained a matter of scholarly debate. Today's evaluation, Kethmorg announced, his voice carrying the resonant quality that came from having vocal cords made of crystallized carbon, will separate true warriors from those who merely occupy space in our training facilities. His energy aura flickered with a kind of barely controlled power that made smart people start calculating blast radii and evacuation routes. The elite students arranged themselves in the arena's center with the practiced confidence of individuals who had never encountered a problem that couldn't be solved through superior firepower. Those whose molten core heritage made him look like a living sculpture of volcanic glass and bad intentions, stretched his arms in a display that sent waves of heat shimmering across the arena floor. Yindala's phase walker abilities allowed her to flicker in and out of visible reality, her form occasionally becoming translucent as she shifted between dimensional phases. Nexpol simply stood motionless, his void render presence creating small distortions in the air around him as reality bent to accommodate his existence. In the observation galleries that ringed the arena, other students watched with the mixture of anticipation and anxiety that characterized academic environments where the final exams could potentially result in actual death. The seating arrangement followed the Institute's hierarchical principles, with apex species occupying the premium viewing positions and everyone else distributed below according to their Combat Worthiness Index ratings. Tucked into a corner of the lowest observation tier, Elena Vasquez sat with her sketchbook balanced on her knees, apparently absorbed in drawing rather than paying attention to the proceedings below. Her presence at the Institute had been something of a bureaucratic accident, A clerical error in the application processing system had resulted in her admission before anyone noticed that humans rank somewhere between houseplants and decorative minerals on the combat worthiness scale. By the time the mistake was discovered, correcting it would have required admitting that the Institute's supposedly foolproof evaluation system had confused a bipedal mammal from a backwater planet with something actually dangerous, so administrators had decided to let her stay as a cautionary example. Elena's fellow students had long since stopped noticing her existence, which suited her perfectly fine. While they engaged in elaborate displays of natural superiority and casual cruelty, she continued her sketching with the focused attention of someone working on a particularly complex art project. Her drawings, to anyone who bothered looking, appeared to be random anatomical studies and technical diagrams, the kind of idle doodling that suggested someone trying to stay awake during boring lectures. Volunteers. Keth Morg's question carried the implicit assumption that volunteering was really just a polite formality before he selected his preferred demonstration subjects. Vrakthos stepped forward immediately, his molten core cycling to combat temperature with audible crackling sounds. "I'll provide the demonstration, Master Instructor," he announced with the confidence of someone who had never met opposition that couldn't be melted into component atoms. Keth Morg's crystalline features arranged themselves into what passed for approval among his species. "Excellent. You'll demonstrate proper elimination techniques against." His energy-enhanced vision swept the observation galleries with predatory calculation before settling on the small human figure in the corner. "You. The sketching one." Elena looked up from her notebook with the expression of someone who had just realized they were being addressed by name at a party where they didn't know anyone. "Me." "Yes, you," Keth Morg replied with the patience of someone explaining basic physics to a particularly slow child. Combat assessment requires practical application against diverse opponent classifications. Your participation will provide valuable data on engagement protocols when facing minimal threat scenarios. The ripple of laughter that spread through the observation galleries carried the cruel undertone of students who understood they were about to witness something between a combat demonstration and a public execution. Elena closed her sketchbook with the careful precision of someone handling a delicate instrument, then made her way down to the arena floor with the resigned gait of someone who had clearly drawn the short straw in life's cosmic lottery. The arena's smart matter flooring adjusted automatically to accommodate combat conditions, its surface becoming slightly yielding to absorb impact while maintaining sufficient stability for complex maneuvers. Environmental controls activated, creating a perfectly regulated atmosphere that could support both human respiration and molten core thermal requirements without killing either participant immediately. Standard engagement protocols, Keth Morg announced as the combatants took their positions. Termination conditions include surrender, incapacitation, or... He paused meaningfully. Administrative intervention for safety concerns. Vrakthos began his pre-combat routine with theatrical flair, his internal furnaces ramping up to operational temperature with a slow inevitability of geological processes. Steam rose from his crystalline skin as moisture in the air flash-boiled on contact, while his molten core began cycling at frequencies that made the arena floor vibrate with sympathetic resonance. The smart matter surface beneath his feet started showing scorch marks as radiant heat exceeded the system's compensation capabilities. "This won't take long," he called across the arena to Elena, his voice carrying the casual cruelty of someone who genuinely believed he was being generous by offering advance warning. "Try to make it educational." Elena stood at her end of the combat space with the same unremarkable posture she maintained during lectures, hands at her sides, looking for all the world like someone who had accidentally wandered into the wrong room and was too polite to correct the mistake. Her breathing remained steady, her stance relaxed, showing no indication that she faced an opponent whose species had colonized 7-star systems through the elegant simplicity of turning anything that opposed them into molten slag. The observation galleries fell silent with the hushed attention usually reserved for natural disasters or particularly spectacular accidents. Betting pools formed spontaneously among the student body, though the odds were so heavily skewed that most wagering focused on exactly how many seconds Elena would remain conscious rather than any possibility of alternative outcomes. Vrakthos began his approach with the measured confidence of someone savoring a particularly fine vintage. His molten core reached optimal combat temperature, internal pressure building toward the threshold where he could project concentrated streams of liquefied rock with surgical precision. His crystalline armor plates shifted and aligned, creating the interlocking defensive matrix that made his species virtually immune to conventional attacks. The arena's environmental systems struggled to compensate for the rising temperature, as Rakdos closed the distance, heat shimmer creating distortion effects that made him appear to move through liquid air. His footsteps left glowing impressions in the smart matter flooring, which immediately began emergency cooling protocols to prevent structural damage. Elena remained motionless until Rakdos reached optimal striking distance, at which point she did something that violated several fundamental principles of combat theory and at least 3 laws of basic survival instinct. Instead of attempting to retreat, dodge, or otherwise minimize her exposure to an opponent who could literally melt her into component molecules, she stepped forward. Her movement was so unexpected that Rakdos actually hesitated, his combat subroutine struggling to process tactical data that didn't conform to any known behavioral patterns. In that moment of confusion, Elena's right hand swept upward in a deceptively simple motion that appeared to be nothing more than an awkward attempt at striking his chest. Her fingertips made contact with a specific point on Rakdos's crystalline exoskeleton, directly above where his molten core interfaced with his neural control matrix. The touch was gentle, almost tentative, lasting perhaps 1/10 of a second before she withdrew her hand and stepped back. For a moment, nothing happened. Rakdos stood frozen in place, his combat protocols apparently locked in some kind of processing loop. Then his molten core began to fluctuate wildly, internal pressure cycling between extremes as his regulatory systems encountered cascade failure. The brilliant glow that had emanated from his form flickered and dimmed, heat shimmer dissipating as his internal temperature plummeted toward normal atmospheric levels. With a sound like breaking glass mixed with disappointed sighs, Rakdos collapsed to the arena floor. His crystalline armor lost cohesion, individual plates separating and clattering across the smart matter surface with musical tones that would have been pleasant under different circumstances. His molten core, deprived of its control mechanisms, cycled down to dormant state with pathetic gurgling sounds. The silence that followed was the kind of profound quiet that suggested the universe itself was double-checking its fundamental constants. In the observation galleries, students sat frozen with expressions that ranged from stunned disbelief to existential crisis. Even Kethmorg's energy aura had gone completely still, a reaction that in Apex Ravager physiology indicated either deep meditation or complete system failure. Elena stood over her fallen opponent with the same unremarkable demeanor she'd maintained throughout the encounter, as if temporarily disabling a supposedly superior life form was roughly equivalent to successfully assembling furniture from confusing instructions. She looked down at Rakdos, who was making small whimpering sounds while his systems attempted emergency restart procedures, then glanced up at the observation galleries with the expression of someone waiting for further instructions. "Explain." The word emerged from Kethmorg's crystalline form, with the kind of harmonic distortion that suggested his vocal systems were struggling with concepts that exceeded their design parameters. Elena blinked, apparently surprised by the question. "Explain what, exactly?" "The resonance point," Kethmorg managed, his voice carrying the strained quality of someone trying to solve equations with insufficient data. Molten core physiology includes multiple redundant control systems, specifically designed to prevent exactly what just occurred. The interface between neural matrix and thermal regulation is protected by 17 different backup mechanisms. Elena glanced down at her sketchbook, then back at the instructor with the expression of someone who had just realized they might have accidentally revealed more than intended. "Oh, that. I've been taking notes." She opened her battered notebook, and for the first time, the observers in the galleries got a clear view of what she'd been so diligently working on during months of classes. The pages visible from their angle contained detailed anatomical diagrams, frequency analysis charts, and what appeared to be comprehensive structural vulnerability assessments. Not random artwork or lecture notes, but systematic technical documentation that would have made professional military analysts weep with professional envy. "You've been studying us," Yindala said, her phase walker abilities flickering erratically as emotional distress interfered with her dimensional control. "That's what students do, isn't it?" Elena replied with the matter-of-fact tone of someone stating an obvious truth. Study things. She flipped through several pages of her notebook, revealing layer upon layer of detailed technical analysis. Molten core species rely on harmonic resonance between their neural matrix and thermal regulation systems, but the interface frequency can be disrupted with precise vibrational input applied at the correct anatomical location. Phase walkers maintain dimensional stability through quantum entanglement fields that can be collapsed with targeted electromagnetic interference. Void renders manipulate reality through localized spacetime distortion, but their control mechanisms have exploitable feedback loops. She looked up from her notes to find the entire arena staring at her, with the kind of fascinated horror usually reserved for particularly venomous wildlife discoveries. I mean, everyone demonstrates their capabilities during training sessions. I just documented the technical specifications. Keth Morg's crystalline structure began resonating at frequencies that his translator rendered as something between nervous laughter and systematic breakdown. You've been conducting intelligence analysis on your fellow students for academic purposes. Intelligence analysis. Elena looked genuinely puzzled by the terminology. I prefer to call it comprehensive note-taking, though I suppose the methodology is similar. She closed a notebook and tucked it under her arm with a casual gesture of someone handling routine homework rather than documentation that could potentially revolutionize galactic military doctrine. The implications began spreading through the observation galleries like a slow-acting virus. If one unremarkable human student could systematically analyze and catalog the exploitable vulnerabilities of supposedly superior species, using nothing more than careful observation and basic note-taking, what did that suggest about the fundamental assumptions underlying the Combat Worthiness Index? About the wisdom of dismissing entire civilizations based on their apparent lack of natural weapons? About the possibility that intelligence might be a more significant factor in survival than evolutionary advantages? Vrakthos finally managed to struggle back to his feet, his crystalline armor slowly reassembling itself as his systems completed their restart sequence. He looked at Elena with the expression of someone who had just discovered that their supposedly impregnable fortress was actually made of wishful thinking and architectural oversights. "You cheated," he said, though his voice carried no real conviction. "Did I?" Elena asked with genuine curiosity. "I used no weapons, no technology, no assistance from external sources. I simply applied knowledge gained through systematic observation during routine academic activities." She tilted her head thoughtfully. If understanding your opponent's vulnerabilities constitutes cheating, then military academies across the galaxy might want to reconsider their curriculum standards. The observation galleries erupted in urgent conversation as students began frantically reviewing their own assumptions, sharing worried glances, and generally exhibiting the behavioral patterns of people who had just realized they'd been walking through a minefield while blindfolded. The apex predator species, who moments before had been the undisputed masters of their academic domain, now found themselves wondering what other inferior species might have been conducting their own systematic analyses. Keth Morg raised one crystalline appendage for silence, his energy aura focusing on Elena with the intensity of someone trying to solve a particularly complex puzzle. "What other observations have you documented?" Elena glanced around the arena, taking in the faces of her classmates with the analytical gaze of someone conducting a final review of collected data. "Well," she said slowly, "I've noticed that most species here tend to rely entirely on their single greatest evolutionary advantage while completely ignoring their fundamental vulnerabilities. It creates very predictable behavioral patterns." She paused, then added with the kind of casual observation that tends to reshape entire worldviews. "Also, everyone assumes that because humans don't have obvious natural weapons, we don't have any weapons at all." "And do you?" Next Paul asked, his void render presence creating small ripples in space-time as emotional stress interfered with his reality manipulation. "Have weapons." Elena smiled for the first time since the encounter began, and there was something in that expression that made several students instinctively calculate escape routes. "We have the most dangerous weapon in the known universe," she replied with the quiet confidence of someone stating an absolute truth. "We have the ability to learn anything." The silence that followed was different from the shocked quiet that had greeted Vrakthos's defeat. This was the contemplative silence of minds struggling to process paradigm-shifting information, the kind of quiet that occurs when fundamental assumptions crumble and new realities begin forming in their place. Keth Morg's crystalline structure stopped its harmonic vibration as his analytical systems finally finished processing the implications of what he'd witnessed. "Class dismissed," he announced, though his voice carried the distant quality of someone whose attention was focused on far more significant concerns than daily lesson plans. "All students report for individual assessment revision within the next standard cycle." As the arena emptied, students filed past Elena with expressions ranging from newfound respect to barely concealed alarm. The apex predator species who had begun the session with casual arrogance now moved with the careful deliberation of people who had discovered that their comfortable assumptions about galactic hierarchies might require some serious revision. Elena remained on the arena floor, reopening her notebook and adding several final observations about the session's events. Her handwriting was neat, methodical, utterly unremarkable, exactly the kind of mundane record-keeping that had allowed her to compile what amounted to a comprehensive vulnerability assessment of her classmates without anyone noticing. From the observation deck, Keth Morg watched her work with the fascinated attention of someone observing a particularly interesting phenomenon. In his extensive career as an instructor, he had witnessed countless demonstrations of natural ability, genetic superiority, and evolutionary advantage. But this was something entirely different, the systematic application of intelligence to overcome seemingly impossible odds through nothing more than careful observation and strategic analysis. It occurred to him that the Institute's administrators might want to reconsider their admission criteria. After all, if the goal was truly to foster interspecies martial excellence, perhaps they should pay more attention to species that excelled at understanding others rather than simply destroying them. Elena finished her notes, closed her notebook, and headed for the exit with the same unremarkable gait that had characterized her arrival. As she reached the arena's entrance, she paused and glanced back at the scorch marks where Vrakthos had been standing. Then she opened her notebook one final time and added a single line to her observations. Note: resonance disruption requires less precise frequency matching than initially calculated. Reduce complexity of interference pattern by approximately 20% for future applications. She closed the notebook, tucked it under her arm, and disappeared into the corridor beyond, leaving behind an arena full of individuals who were suddenly very interested in reviewing their own assumptions about intelligence, observation, and the true meaning of evolutionary advantage. The Institute's rigid hierarchy hadn't exactly collapsed, but it had certainly developed some very interesting structural flaws, and everyone suspected that the quiet human, with her systematic note-taking, had only shown them the smallest fraction of what those flaws might reveal. In the end, the Stellar Combat Institute continued to exist as a monument to organized violence and poly-disguised xenophobia, but with one small modification: nobody assumed anything was harmless anymore, especially if it carried a notebook and paid very close attention during demonstrations. The Combat Worthiness Index remained in effect, but administrators had quietly begun adding new categories for assessment criteria that had nothing to do with natural weapons and everything to do with the terrifying possibility that some species might actually be paying attention.